We're talking about Judge Juan Marchand, the corrupted Judge Juan Marchand out of New York, and his recent ruling. It was last week. I must have missed it because of all of the news that was happening last week. Judge Marchand dismissed, or he dismissed Trump's motion to vacate the verdict in that New York hush money payment. You know, the hush money 34 count felony conviction coming out of the corrupt commie state of New York. And you recall it was the 34 felony conviction for the hush money bookkeeping issue, which in any realm of the universe would have only been a misdemeanor to begin with, which they then it would have been a misdemeanor that was time barred under the statute of limitations. They managed to find a way to extend the statute of limitations by converting it into a felony charge, by arguing that there was some underlying predicate felony that the concealment was, attempting to hide. So they managed to convert it into a felony. They got a nice politically prejudiced jury to convict Trump on charges they probably couldn't even understand. And since that ruling came down, or since that verdict came down, the Supreme Court came out with its ruling on immunity. And the Supreme Court ruling on immunity was in the presidential immunity case, where they basically said, for the president, there's absolute immunity for core constitutional duties. There is no immunity for purely personal acts, and there's presumptive immunity for everything in between. You got to prove what is either purely personal or presidential in order to determine whether or not immunity applies. It wasn't just the immunity question that was relevant for the New York case, because in the SCOTUS ruling, they also said that evidence adduced from a presidential act would be invalid or, impermissible evidence, even if it were used to prove a purely personal act. And so in the Trump New York case, there was correspondence between with Hope Hicks, White House staff when Trump was president, which was, if you're not a totally corrupt communist judge, obviously prima facie presidential acts, or at least presidential correspondence communications. Thus, the evidence adduced of it during the New York trial was invalid. So Trump says, look, in light of the Supreme Court ruling, you've got to vacate the conviction, vacate the verdict, and basically start from scratch, because evidence that was adduced during this trial was prima facie on its face presidential communications, even if it was used to prove a purely private act, that being concealing the payment to Stormy Daniels and whatever. Okay. So the judge, it's a 41-page ruling. And in order to appreciate how insane you have to be to get to the conclusion that you want to get to, you got to start in reverse. And you got to say, Judge Juan Marchand, I'm going to go on a long rant here. And interrupt anytime, people. But
you good?
Parade.
Okay. Whose daughter you may remember. Her name is Lauren Marchand. She's an executive president at Authentic HQ. The other partner at that firm is the guy who started White Dudes for Harris, or Dudes for Harris. I forget which one. She has been fundraising off of this persecution, literally for Adam Schiff, for Kamala Harris, for Democrats' political action committees. She, raking in money hand over fist off the prosecution that her father is spearheading. And so if you come to the conclusion that this corrupt judge needs to say the acts accused of Trump in the hush money case were purely private acts, and the evidence was somehow also purely private and thus admissible, but even if it wasn't, we still want to admit it, that's where the judge wants to go. And so in this 41-page ruling, the judge basically says, to get around the first question, the hush money payments were purely personal because they occurred before Trump was president, although the payments actually occurred when he was president. He says, look, it was purely personal because we all agree on it. We've stipulated among the parties, including Trump's team, they were purely personal acts to make those payments, even though they were made when Trump was president. Okay. How do you get around the fact that the evidence adduced was presidential communications with White House staff while he was president? Well, you say it was done in furtherance of a purely personal act, and therefore we get to admit that evidence because it was made in furtherance of a personal act, and therefore we get to deem it as purely personal. But, and it's the most amazing catch-all, Kelly, if you can bring up that highlight of the decision, the judge basically says it's purely personal, admissible, but even if it weren't, and it were in fact evidence adduced in violation of the Supreme Court ruling on immunity, it was harmless, sufficiently harmless in light of the overwhelming evidence of guilt of the defendant, Trump. And so this ruling is just the next stage of the judicial madness coming out of New York, where the judge basically finds a way to, that's right. There was an issue of preservation of some of the objections as well. And the judge said, yeah, Trump properly preserved his objections to the admissibility of this evidence, except when it came to Michael Cohen. But even with Michael Cohen, even if he had properly preserved his objections, it would have been overturned anyhow because the evidence would have been valid. Let me see what it says here. It says it's any mistake they made in allowing this evidence is harmless because the evidence was irrelevant, though adduced as evidence, and irrelevant in light of Trump's overwhelming guilt. And so the judge basically dismissed Trump's motion to to vacate the verdict, reaffirmed the conviction, so he can now delay sentencing for whenever. Potentially, they're going to have the sentencing, sentence Trump to whatever the sentence would be, and suspend that while he's president to impose it after he's president, which raises a next level element of corruption, which is exactly that Merchan can hold over Trump's presidency like a sword of Damocles to say, we'll sentence you to jail if you piss me off while you're president, so you better be a president that I like ideologically, or I'll send you to jail when you get out of being president in 4 years. So it's the utmost of judicial corruption coming out of New York State. Everyone should, pack up your shit and leave because the court systems don't work. And unless the Court of Appeal comes in here to overturn this ruling from Merchan, to overturn Engoron's ruling in the Letitia James persecution, you're dealing with a corrupt state where you know that you cannot confidently do business, live, exist without fearing, the political hammer that can come down because they don't like your ideology.
So I have a question, Viva. So what you say this is judicial corruption. Could the judge face any type of legal action or legal charges for conducting legal corruption like this or judicial corruption?
Well, so that is the question, and judges can be impeached. The question is who's going to impeach them. It's got in New York, it's a state level judge, and so who's going to do it? Is it going to be Hochul, who is very happy with this political persecution? So the bottom line is there is in theory some potential. You could have sanctions, you could have impeachment processes, but you have to have the political will to do it in the first place. You don't have that out of New York. I mean, take also the example out of Georgia, where you had the Court of Appeal reverse Judge, I think his name is Scott McAfee. Who's McAfee that did the virus? Whatever. Judge McAfee, the one who refused to disqualify Fani. And so he basically came up with a totally incongruous decision, which had all the facts warranting removal and then refused to do it. He was running for re-election. He got reelected. It worked out well for him. Fani was running for re-election. She got reelected. It worked out for her. Then the Court of Appeal comes in and says, yeah, your ruling was totally idiotic, and we overturn a part of it. That's pretty much where it stops because, you need to have the political will from the higher up at the state level to say we're going to go after sanction, file ethics complaints against these judges. Elise Stefanik out of New York has done that. I'm fairly certain she's done that against Engoron and Letitia James. I don't know if she's done anything against Judge Merchan, but you will not have the political will from the higher up who love this. They love this political persecution. They hate Trump. So they're not going to go sanction this judge anytime soon. So the short answer is it's possible, but it's not going to happen.
So it could only come from the state. It can't come from the federal level, like from the federal attorney general or from the Supreme Court or from appellate courts or anything?
You have to get creative and think about whether or not they can, make an accusation or bring charges for violation of civil rights. But I don't think you can do that until you have like someone determining that the process was abusive on its face. I don't. There might be a way to do it. You did have some had other states going after certain states for violating their allegedly violating their election rights. I think it was Texas filing something in New York. I forget the details of that, but. No, I mean, I don't know what you could do at the federal level that wouldn't involve bringing charges for violation of civil rights. It's a conspiracy to violate civil rights, which is what we've seen now in New York. So maybe someone creative does it. Or flip side, maybe the politics of the state change and you get an attorney general who's not a corrupt POS like Letitia James, or you get a governor who's not a corrupt POS like Hochul to go after these rogue corrupt judges.
Yeah. I remember one of the crazy things I heard with that was correct me if I'm wrong, but that the judge let them convict him on one of the 34 counts instead of all of them convicting him on the same count, which normally it's the same charge that you have to convict somebody on. But did he give him the option to convict him on one out of all the 34 charges and then like collectively
No.
Is that wrong?
Well, not wrong. It's sort of. I think maybe if what you're trying to describe, it might be oversimplified or mischaracterized. The issue was the 34 charges. By the way, people don't understand this. It stems from the same payment. So it was the same payment spread out over months, and on a monthly basis, there were basically 34 felony charges, writing the check, entering the ledger, entering it in the book. So the same monthly payment for the one aggregate payment was broken down into 34 felonies because it was done month over month. And each month there were like 2 or 3 felony charges. But what you're thinking of, I think, is when they were going to convict on the felony charge, the issue was that in order for it to be a felony charge, it required a predicate act, which was what is the underlying felony? And there were one of 3 options. It could have been election interference. It could have been, I don't know, say fraudulent concealment. I forget what the 3 potential underlying felony predicate acts would have been. And the jury said, do we need to be unanimous on what the underlying predicate act is to turn this into a felony conviction? And the judge said, no, you do not need to unanimously agree on what the underlying felonious predicate act was in order to convict, which is just basically saying, we're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty, except we don't know which predicate felony act we can agree upon underpinned this felony conviction. But the judge said, don't worry about it. You don't need to agree on that. So it's a mockery of justice, period, full stop.
And that right there is reason not only to go after the judge, if such a thing is possible, but also to go after guys like Alvin Bragg and Letitia James, these corrupt prosecutors who brought these charges in the first place. Because, like you just laid out, it should have been 1 charge at most. They found loopholes that let them split it into 34 individual counts, because going after Trump for 34 felonies sounds better than going after him for 1. So that's why they did it. It's corrupt from the top down, and somebody needs to be held accountable for it.
Worse than that, it would have been 1 charge of a misdemeanor, which would have been a fine, and nobody's ever been prosecuted for it, basically. And then they turned it before felony charge. And the issue is also Bragg didn't want to bring this case in the first place, but you had some puppeteering from the Biden Department of Justice, Biden regime to bring these charges. And after 2 people left Bragg's office because they were so pissed he wouldn't bring the charges, a couple of years later they decided to bring it in what they called a novel legal theory, which is another word for judicial bullshit. I mean, it's nothing but like you say, Connor, I mean, that was the purpose of this. It was get your politically active or your political activist judges, rig the entire system, rig it like they tried to rig with Daniel Penny. Remember, like they said, we're hung on the major charge, so dismiss it, but don't tell the jury it's tantamount to an acquittal, because then they might acquit on the lesser charge, and just hope, cross your fingers, you get a conviction on the lesser charge. It's pure judicial corruption from top to bottom. But who's going to do it? Will there be a way to have the federal government say there was some RICO conspiracy to violate civil rights here? Then you got to prove it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be political blowback at the very least, because this will continue to bankrupt New York State as a state where I wouldn't even drive through, let alone, if I'm a Kevin O'Leary type, invest in that state, where if they decide from one day to the next they don't like you, they can literally put their finger on your business and snuff you out of existence.
Damn. Yeah, it sounds pretty dirty. I mean, just the fact that his daughter is raising money, I would think that would remove any notion of impartiality to begin with.
His daughter was on a podcast in 2019 talking about how she was having discussions with her dad about how he hated politicians who tweet. Not even a vague reference to Trump. It's pure corruption. Trump moved to have. So I think he moved to have the judge removed. I might be mistaken in the cases here, but it's corruption. Yeah, I'm fairly certain that he found a way to say, no, I'm totally objective in this case. My daughter is raising money off of this, sending out emails with Adam Schiff. I think he raised I would say $20 million off of this, give or take. Raising money for
a lot of money.
If anyone can fact check, they were raising millions hand over fist, and by sending out emails directly referencing the case that her daddy is spearheading in New York. And yet somehow, I mean, it's like, justice is blind in terms of like it's got its fingers in its ears. And the judge says, yeah, no, that's not enough of a conflict. I mean, it's an appearance of a conflict. Forget whether or not it's a real conflict. It's an appearance on its face that you have a family of corruption, financially, politically invested in the persecution of a former president, now current president, and the freaking judge doesn't have the political wherewithal to just vacate the verdict and blame it on the Supreme Court. Instead, backflips to say, yeah, the evidence was fine, and even if it wasn't, it's no big deal because he was overwhelmingly guilty. This is communism.
Well, there's a reason it's all happening in New York, too, where Democrat control and political corruption have existed side by side for decades and decades. This couldn't really happen in any other state. I mean, we saw the whole case in Georgia with Fannie Willis, and that was a whole separate thing. But on a minor note, I don't know if we ever covered, she did get kicked off that case, which is, great. Not that the case was really going to hold water anymore because Trump's on his way back to the White House. But when we have people like Letitia James in New York who gets elected making a promise that she's going to go after Trump, it basically amounts to I forget which Soviet leader it was who said, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime."
That was Lavrentia Baria.
Yes. She said the same thing. She said she was going into office just to bring charges against Trump, whatever they might be.
Yep.
And eventually she had to settle on the civil case, which they are still trying to continue because technically it's a civil case and there's no precedent for getting rid of civil cases against presidents. But it's just so corrupt. You'd assume anybody on the outside would be able to recognize this. But to this day, there are still Democrats who walk around saying, "Oh, Trump's a multiple-time convicted felon and he's a fraudster." All that fraud he committed where the victim showed up to testify on his behalf saying there was no fraud, was saying he's a rapist, even though he was never actually convicted of rape. And
The lady was crazy.
yeah, you would assume
The mouse house lady.
rational people would eventually be able to realize, okay, this whole thing is like a corrupt rig system, right? No such
And
thing.
Connor, let's not give New York the whole credit. I don't know if you guys read the story. $24 billion missing from the homeless fund in California.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Sure is.
Nothing to show for it. Nothing.
Except more homeless
Absolutely.
people.
And no, listen, it got worse since they started getting that money. This is absolutely crazy. And they keep on voting for these people. So I don't even know.
It is you have to highlight something, and Connor mentioned it. What's her face? Letitia James campaigned off prosecuting Trump personally. What's her face? Fannie Willis campaigned off prosecuting Trump personally. You say, like, in certain states this works better than others. Yeah, like Illinois, New York, California, Michigan, it works. Georgia, it worked a little less. And by the way, yeah, in that case, Fannie Willis's entire office was disqualified because the Georgia Court of Appeals came in and said nothing in what Scott McAfee crafted by way of decision resolved the appearance of conflict that he actually recognized. The only solution in this rare case is yeeting her from the entire case. They didn't dismiss the indictment, but they effectively did, because now it's an indictment without a prosecuting office, and I don't think anybody's going to rush to pick up that big steaming pile of crap. But yeah, this only works in states, cultures where the corruption has been normalized, and it tends to be blue states where this is it's been normalized. And I don't think that they don't realize it, Connor. I think that they understand it. They just like it because for now they're the ones holding the bat, not realizing that at some point in time there will be a political shift, and they could very well be the victims of the same type of treatment that they're inflicting on others.
And here's the worst part about it too, is that very often when we talk about these things, there need to be repercussions for these people. We need to go after corrupt prosecutors, Soros-backed DAs, people who are actively making things worse, engaging in corruption, and targeting their political enemies. You hear within the right wing, the even within the Trump base of, no, we can't do that. That sets dangerous precedent. We can't target the corrupt people. We can't do these big sweeping overhauls and investigations because well, imagine if the shoe was on the other foot of, if Democrats were doing that, that would be bad. Yeah, I agree. If Democrats were doing it, it would be bad because they have proven time and time again that their motivations are bad. But it's not bad to investigate corrupt government officials. The problem was not that they were investigating Trump for all these crimes. The problem was that he didn't do any of them. Had he committed these felony crimes and sexual assaults and fraud, great, go after him. It's good to target corrupt politicians and people who take advantage of others. But they made the entire thing up. And that's why there's the problem. So it's not bad when we do it because, or at least you'd hope, it's based on something solid, not just complete fabrication.
No, you compare the. Oh, sorry, go for it.
No, I was just gonna say, is there anything they could do with this? Does this have any teeth or momentum or anything at all? Because I've heard people asking the question, could they try to put Trump in jail while he's president? Like, is there a level of seriousness around this?
No, first of all, I mean, whatever sentence whatever sentence the corrupt Merchant is going to give him, it has to be suspended at the very least until he's no longer president. You can't lock up the president while he's president. But and whether or not it's going to be like a slap on the wrist, a probation or whatever, but it's going to get. I mean, it has to get overturned and appealed. It just has to, because if it doesn't, it's going to cause irreparable harm, much in the same way the Engeron decision is going to cause irreparable harm in New York. So it's going to work its way up to the Court of Appeals, and they're going to get it right. They have to, and if they don't, there's still Supreme Court questions at issue here. But I mean, but the bottom line is the Merchants of the world have been totally empowered to run amok. And Connor, when you say like everyone says, well, the right shouldn't do it. I think it was Kash Patel who, he said it will be justice, not vengeance. And there's a big fat difference. When you have egregious corruption, it needs to be dealt with. When you have legitimate accusations, or at least plausible accusations of sexual impropriety, they investigate it. Plausible would be Tara Reid, whose accusations against Joe Biden are in fact corroborated by Lisa Bloom, Gloria Allred's daughter, in real time. The tweet is still there that says, yeah, we know that Biden had touchy hands and we believed you. You weren't asking for anything. Not plausible is batshit crazy E. Jean Carroll concocting a hallucination from 35 years ago and then extending the window of opportunity to sue for that by modifying the law for 1 year so that E. Jean Carroll can be the first one to get her lawsuit in after she and her lawyer petitioned to have the law changed so they can get an equally corrupt jury of Trump's peers to convict or to find liability, and an equally corrupt Judge Kaplan, who, despite the verdict, jury saying he did not rape E. Jean Carroll, we determined that the judge adjudicates him as a rapist nonetheless. I mean, justice is different than vengeance, and we need to see a whole hell of a lot of justice in 2025.
So if you like this clip, click right here. And if you want to see more like it, click right here. Stay angry, Patriots.